All right. Good morning. Good morning from Denver, Colorado. My name is John Padilla. I'm a managing director of IPD Latin America. And in the last of our curtain raiser series for the Madrid Energy Conference 2023, taking place in Madrid, Spain on April 18th to the 20th, I'm pleased to be joined by Jose Zapata, partner at Holland and Knight. Good morning, Jose.
Hello, John. How are you? What a pleasure to be online and a pleasure to be participating in the Madrid Energy Conference as always.
No, and we are absolutely delighted to have Jose back and Holland and Knight back. They have been with us since the onset, since 2019. And so Jose is joining us from Bogota, but I think we're all looking forward to being in Madrid in just a couple of weeks. So, and I appreciate you taking the time here right before Semana Santa break. So a lot of people are stepping out, but I think that our conversation here will certainly be stimulating and hopefully excite some people as well to come join us. And what we wanted to do this morning was really kind of take a look at some of the bigger kind of macro trends that are going on in the globe. I mean, we just saw OPEC make a voluntary cut. Oil prices are now on track, or there's fear that they'll track back up towards $100. So obviously there's inflationary concerns, and the big R, recession is back in the mix. And more prominent than ever. Meanwhile, we have energy transition, and there's, I think, a bigger theme that impacts Latin America that I'd really like to tease out with you, Jose, which is just investment. And so, while we've seen fairly limited efforts being undertaken in the Western countries outside of perhaps the Inflation Reduction Act of the United States, which really kind of only impacts Mexico, China has continued its march in terms of infrastructure and energy sector investment in the region. And so I think that creates kind of a overarching kind of theme that's interesting to kind of take a look at. Your law firm has a quite wide footprint and deals with international clients all over the place. And I think maybe to start things off, I'd really be interested in your kind of views as to how you see Chinese investment throughout Latin America taking place right now. Is it increasing? Is it kind of holding steady? How do you see the status of that?
Thanks, John. No, I think that your point is a very important one, and it ties to the activities from a legal perspective we've been doing throughout the region. This includes countries like Panama, most of Central America, Guyana, Peru, Colombia, etc. At the end of the day, when you look at the region as a whole, what has been happening really is, I would say, that not only in energy and natural resources, but also in infrastructure and strategic minerals, the Chinese companies that are coming into the region have been very, very active. And I think that there are a couple of elements which are critical vis-a-vis the energy transition, which one should not forget to mention. And that includes, of course, what I would call first and foremost a very aggressive approach. So a very important difference, to other countries out of Europe, North America, etc., is that these Chinese companies really want to make and perfect those investments. So that's what I call the aggressive approach to the energy transition. And I would imagine, of course, that from a standard doctrine that's out there, that it is, of course, an interest of the government of China to develop the energy transition in its benefit. And I think that is aligned with the companies that we're seeing in the region very active. And the second thing I would mention really is what I would call a greater appetite for the opportunity vis-a-vis the risks. So this ties not only into the energy transition itself, but to what we could call, the evolution and the importance of non-renewables in the energy transition. So they are not only looking at renewables as an option, but they're also looking at how those non-renewables can play an active role into the energy transition in a very effective way, which downplays the risks vis-a-vis the benefits. Works in my view is, which is very interesting, contrary to what we do in standard due diligence and standard investments, is that they will look at those risks and liabilities in a much more aggressive manner again. And what that means is they're willing to sacrifice a little bit more on the liability risk, on the country risk side, and say, no, you know what? It's worth investing. It's a long-term investment. We're there for the long run. We have the funds, and we want to get into our footprint there. And so therefore what happens is they come in, and they will come in effectively. And that's something that I think is very interesting. And again, it ties to different approaches historically, where, we would do a standard due diligence. If there were hiccups, companies would shy away from the investment. That's not the way we see that approach. It's a different approach to that respect. And therefore, I think that what we will be seeing over the next 10 years is a very, very strong Chinese presence in Latin America, which has been, and which I think will continue to grow given the importance of this. And I would simply add to that first question you present, is that ties perfectly, in my view, into strategic minerals and requirements for the energy transition. Companies, these companies are looking at aggressively developing their sales of electric vehicles, their sales of electric supplies for renewables, and strategic supplies for that industry. And therefore, they're not only looking at it from an upstream perspective, but from what I would call a downstream distribution perspective. So it's their products with their minerals, with their investments, what's growing in the region. And again, with governments that, as we all know, are more inclined to the left, it would appear that they are not as concerned as other countries with that reality. And on the contrary, they're exploiting that reality in a much more effective manner. So I think that it's going to continue to advance very effectively, John.
Yeah, no, and I think rare earth minerals and metals is a big issue in Latin America as a region. I mean, besides the kind of world-class renewable sources that it also has pretty significant, rare earth minerals, etc., metals. And so the question is, I mean, are they only competing on price, or what other things are you seeing? Are you seeing an evolution at all in terms of how they're competing? I mean, you talked a little bit about due diligence, but are there other ways that you're seeing kind of adaptation take place by Chinese companies, or is the main factor, does it continue to be price?
That's a great question. No, I don't think it's priced, to be very blunt. I mean, I think, again, the opportunities in energy in Latin America are immense. And sometimes, you get the impression that there should be much more ongoing than what's there. Evidently, price is indicative always of investment, but I would not say that is the core issue when you're looking at these companies making those investments. I think that they're looking more at again, fixing their position in the country and being able to assess and define a stronghold in Latin America, and that's what I think is critical. Now, having said that, what is the long-term play? In my view, the long-term game here, in my view, is if this energy mix continues to advance, I would say all countries in Latin America are keen on the energy mix. The problem that these countries have is really, same types of environmental limitations, social issues associated with renewables. Not that, we used to see that in non-renewables, but the same types of problems are still there, sort of a stagnant situation with respect to non-renewables vis-a-vis renewables. And that situation, of course, you have to play it out in a longer time frame. If you think you're going to be able to set up a wind farm, a solar project in the short term, that's not that easy still in Latin America. And and that requires a little bit more patience. And therefore, what I would say is that these companies coming from China are willing to stay longer, are willing to take it more slowly if need be, are willing to speak more actively with the governments that are currently in office in Latin America, and that gives them a very strong position vis-a-vis, projects that might be, less expensive today from a pricing perspective, but at the end of the day will take some more time than what is expected. The standard company coming out of the U.S., the standard company coming out of Europe, may want to be able to start the operations in a year and be up and running and COD ready, et cetera, et cetera. And that may take more time. And that's where you have a difference of opinion. You have companies coming out of China that are willing to stay for a longer run, and maybe companies that are saying, the return is not there as fast as I was expecting. Maybe I should find a different jurisdiction. But that will play, as I mentioned in our first question, it will play very interestingly vis-a-vis the long-term footprint that China has in Latin America in renewables and in the market of renewables into the future. I would simply add that ties into what we've heard in the region also with respect to issues like hydrogen and green hydrogen in particular. So if companies have invested in renewables, then they have the door open to produce green hydrogen, which is something that the region is looking at very actively, particularly Chile and Colombia. And that would be something that, of course, if you're not there at the renewable level, then you might be losing out also in the longer timeline with respect to green hydrogen.
Perfect. Let's pivot real quickly over to kind of policy issues, I think, for Western countries. And I mean, thoughts on, what are the advantages, I guess, of, let's call it, U.S., Canadian, European companies operating in the region, and from a policy perspective, what kind of things can governments be doing better, right? I mean, at least from the United States perspective, I think there's a view that it's an afterthought. I mean, I have that kind of conversation with a lot of people, both in and outside of the sector. So your thoughts on what kind of things can be, should we be looking to do, particularly, with the Biden administration that has been so heavily focused on energy transition, and the focus on the rest of the region is certainly something that has not really kind of come to bear thus far.
That's another great question, Don. Really, I mean, at the end of the day, I will say historically, despite the many ups and downs, I would say that most of Latin America has, of course, looked up, particularly to the U.S. and more to Canada. So I would say that the first thing is that there's a very important historic component there, that is a reality, because of where the U.S. stands in Latin America and historically, where that financing has been coming from into Latin America. Now, one of the hiccups, which is curious that we see now, is while we would have expected that the U.S. and Canada, were much more active in Latin America from a transition perspective, that place, that position has been taken over by companies like the ones we were referring to out of China, which doesn't make much sense from a historic perspective. So what you would be looking at really, and what from a policy perspective one would expect, is really a much more aggressive investment perspective from the US and Canada into Latin America on the renewable side, on the energy transition side. And that investment is not only, the companies out of these countries investing in Latin America, but also the composition of issues like technology transfers, training, and many other aspects, development of products, development of basic supplies that are needed for the energy transition, and that type of thing. So at the end of the day, one would have expected this to grow much more in that course of events, but that has not been the case. And curiously, when you look at it, generally, the policy issue has been focused more significantly on security issues, concerns associated with drugs concerns, other concerns that do not tie really directly into the energy transition itself. You know, one of the discussions I have always had is, you know, when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act and other interests that are developing very actively in the U.S. or in turn in Canada, you know, you would say, is there a chapter there that goes and focuses directly into Latin America? And why? Because that is strategic from a policy perspective. If the Americas as a whole has an adequate energy mix, you're positioning yourself in a much more different manner than what has happened in other regions positively. So I do think that from a policy perspective, there has to be some more interest or greater interest in being able to assess the implications of not developing Latin America effectively and not assisting Latin America effectively in something that would be, in my view, of natural interest to the U.S. and Canada. I studied in the U.S., I studied in Canada, and, you know, both great countries with great developments on the energy side. Why is that not coming in more effectively into Latin America? Why is that not being developed more? And that is something that I would say is of concern, because that ties into more complex issues like the political scenarios in Latin America and the discussions between left and right, and what we're seeing where, you know, you might say, well, if governments are feeling that Asian countries, Chinese countries are investing much more, then we should shift our focus to China rather than maintain our focus in the US and Canada. In other areas such as minerals and oil and gas in the past, Canada and the US played a very important role and continue to play a very important role. That same role, I'm afraid I'm not seeing from a renewable energy perspective. So I do think that is an opportunity from a policy perspective that has to be developed.
Fantastic. Well, we're clearly going to have to continue the conversation over our opening cocktail reception there on the 18th. But let's do one last kind of lightning round question to wrap things up. And it's just maybe just a couple of quick thoughts on what can Western private sector companies be doing differently to better position themselves in the region. Are there some things that we've seen over the last couple of decades in terms of their investment, how they've approached it? We haven't even touched into the kind of community issues, et cetera, which are clearly starting to become much more prevalent. What kind of things can they be doing? Just some quick little thoughts, sound bites.
Yeah, that's also very important. I think three things off the top of my mind, John. Number one, I think that you have to be able to assess the manner in which there is a difference between the rule of law and how practical issues evolve in each of these countries. I think that a top is always, you look at the manual, you look at the book, and it says you'll have an environmental license in 6 months. That's not going to happen. If you understand it's going to take a year, then there's less of a frustration. So number one, being able to understand the practicalities of each jurisdiction. Number two, being able to structure your investments in a more appropriate fashion vis-a-vis many left-wing governments. So that does not mean you're not going to have protection to your rights. It simply means you have to structure it in a different manner, so you don't feel that you're being hindered with respect to those investments that you made in those countries, and that you really are protected from an investment perspective. And three, I would say, going back to our due diligence discussion, it's the manner in which you assess risks. If you want zero risks, that is very expensive. And in renewables, there are abundant risks, and the rate of return is not that high. So it's being able to understand how that works in LATAM, and that would definitely assist. So I think that those three top-level issues, without prejudice of discussing it more in Madrid, definitely can help Western companies develop their activities more effectively and being successful, because, again, those opportunities are there.
Perfect. No, we'll have to leave it there. I appreciate your time, your thoughts, Jose. Look forward to seeing you in Madrid, and we look forward to welcoming many new faces there in Madrid here just in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much. We'll see you then. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Take care. Great seeing you.
All right. Bye-bye.